Good morning, everybody. Great to see so many of you here today. And I guess for the first presentation this morning, I'm tasked with just outlining at a high level, really, some of the key regulatory requirements for medical devices and IVDs to elaborate a little bit more about the role of the HPRA in regulating these devices. And I hope to try and put it into some context for you working in the procurement, the use and the delivery of these devices within the health system to make it relevant and to see what that impact might be and how you can, I suppose, prepare for it. And hopefully there'll be some key takeaways that you can bring back with you and as Lorraine and Niall have both mentioned, really to establish those contact points and to have people identified that you can come to in the HPRA, that you know we are open and engaging and would like to encourage more dialogue and more collaboration together in implementing the regulations. So I guess really before we start, I just want to make sure we're all clear on what is really captured under the devices regulatory framework. And I've set out here a broad definition. I suppose firstly, devices are health products. They're used in the diagnosis, prevention, treatment, and monitoring of disease, illness, and disability. I suppose that's just a general kind of catch-all. And really, I suppose, to qualify as a medical devices, these health products must firstly have a medical purpose, and secondly, act by physical means. So if we don't want them to act in a pharmacological, metabolic or immunological way, because then they'd qualify under the medicines legislation. So it's kind of really having a physical action and that they have a medical purpose. And there's really two main types of devices. We have medical devices that are used and placed in contact with the patient or with the person. And I guess, you know, they are differentiated from the second type, which are in vitro diagnostic medical devices, which are not necessarily in contact with the body, and they're used primarily on samples that are taken from the patient. So blood, urine, saliva, to meet the definition and to be used for monitoring, diagnosing, preventing or treatment of disease. I guess in terms of the next two slides then, I've just set out some examples of what these devices might look like. Sorry, didn't mean to, I'll just go back a slide there. So for medical devices, I guess it's a very broad range of devices, ranging from, you know, very basic plasters or bandages, wound care devices, through to the more invasive surgical instruments that you might use in a medical procedure, and then to the more higher risk implantable devices that you might be familiar with in terms of hip implants, etc. And there's some examples there around the range of devices that qualify under this definition. Certain types of software also qualify as devices if they meet the definition in the diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment of disease, illness, or disability. So it's important to consider all of the devices, I guess, that are used in your hospitals. Do they qualify as devices, or all the health products, you know, are they qualifying as devices? And if so, are they captured within your systems and procedures to ensure that they're compliant, to ensure that you can manage the storage, use and delivery of these devices throughout your institution and in your laboratories? And I guess really it's not just the devices that are in use in, I suppose, typically in clinical engineering departments. It's broader than that. It's the devices that are used, yes, in the clinical engineering departments and the large capital equipment, but it's also devices that are used in surgery, in theatre, the implants, the disposable devices, the single-use devices, and that software as well. So I guess the scope is huge, and I suppose the regulatory system is framed to try and acknowledge, I suppose, and capture best the devices to an appropriate regulatory framework. For IVDs then, I guess there's some examples on the slide here too. Some might be self-tests, that the patient may use themselves at home. I guess we're all familiar with the COVID antigen tests and others. And then there's also professional use only tests and near patient tests as well. And I guess they range from, similar to devices, there's quite a broad range in them, and their impact, I guess, is based on risk, and that will determine the conformity assessment for compliance for those devices. So how are these broad range of health products regulated? I guess it would be very difficult to have a specific piece of legislation that would address specific products. So they are categorized into groups based on risk, and we have risk classes of devices, and both medical devices and IVDs have 4 risk classes. And I guess really the rules are outlined in the legislation. And I suppose really the greater the risk involved with the device, the greater the level of regulation for the device. And I guess Lorraine has already mentioned that, you know, the regulatory framework for devices isn't the same as medicines. And just, I suppose, first and foremost, the HPRA does not authorise, approve, licence medical devices, and neither does any other medical device competent authority in Europe. It's a different framework. It's called a decentralised system, and that means there's no central structure or there's no central authority responsible and over licensing or authorizing medical devices. Really, it's the onus is on the manufacturer to demonstrate compliance with the regulatory requirements and to follow a conformity assessment procedure based on the relevant risk class for the types of devices they manufacture. The 4 risk classes range from the lowest risk, class 1, and for devices they go from class 1, 2A, 2B and 3, based on the level of invasiveness in the body and the duration of time that they're in contact with the body. For IVDs, they have also 4 risk classes, A, B, C and D, A being the lowest risk class and D being the highest risk class, and the highest risk in Class D would have the highest risk for public health as well. The majority of devices that are placed on the market, so excluding the Class A's, IVDs and the Class 1 medical devices, the rest of them will all require some certification or assessment by an independent third party called a notified body. And they're a conformity assessment body that are qualified to assess the compliance of those devices based on their technologies, and they have the appropriate technical expertise and clinical expertise and resource to assess those devices appropriately. The lower risk class then, the Class 1 device and Class A IVDs, they're self-declared to the regulations by the manufacturer. So the manufacturer has to apply the appropriate conformity assessment for those low-risk devices, and then they self-declare compliance. And it's really through the post-market monitoring, the experience of healthcare professionals, of users of those devices on the market, and feeding that back to the manufacturer that the devices are maintained in line with the general safety and performance requirements. Once devices have met their conformity assessment procedures, they're CE marked. So you'll see every device that's placed on the market in use in Irish hospitals and laboratories should have a CE mark to say they've met the conformity assessment procedures outlined in the regulations and they're free for use on the EU market. And just, I suppose, to reiterate again that the HPRA or any other competent authority does not approve or authorise these devices. So I suppose the next couple of slides tries to give a bit of an explanation of the evolution of the regulatory landscape and what you can expect to see in use in hospitals and laboratories today. So I guess Niall had set out, you know, a bit of the background around the adoption of the current regulatory framework. And I suppose up until more recently, we had a number of directives in place governing the medical device system. So there were 3 directives. I guess they were in place until the new regulations were adopted. and the new regulations have become fully applicable since May 2021 for the medical device regulation and May 2022 for the IVD regulation, the in vitro diagnostic regulation. And there's also supplemental national legislation to support those regulations. And they would cover things like the reprocessing of single-use devices that Niall referred to, in terms of the specifying our role as a competent authority and our powers and responsibilities at national level. I guess in terms of the transition from the medical device directives to the regulation, the fundamental principles of the framework exist and have stayed the same. So we still have a risk-based system. It's clarified and there's more rules and clearer risk classes identified across, particularly in the area of IVDs. And it still requires conformity assessment by a third party, that notified body for the majority of devices. I guess what has happened with the MDR and the IVDR is that it has really strengthened the requirements. It's increased traceability and transparency. It's giving more access to data to healthcare professionals who are using the devices and to the patients and public as well. And it's strengthened clinical and technical requirements to ensure that those devices are validated and are safe and perform as they're intended to. And then we have these transitional provisions, and I guess these transitional provisions are put in place to ensure that devices that are placed on the market under the old directives, that were perfectly safe at the time and legally compliant at the time, I suppose in recognition of the regulatory burden the new regulations bring, that we're going to need time to transition to these. So to ensure continuity of patient care, to ensure that there are no shortages in the supply chain, these soft transition provisions were brought in, and what it means is that you will probably see devices under the old directive system and the new regulation system in use in your hospitals. So these transitional provisions are outlined on the slide. And I guess as long as those devices that were certified under the directives, as long as those devices continue to be safe and perform as intended, that there's no safety issues associated with them, and they've no significant design changes, that their certificate supporting the CE mark can be extended in accordance with the timelines on the slide here. So we're really working through a period between now and 2028, 2029, until we'll have a full market of MDR and IVDR compliant devices. So just to reconfirm, I guess, in use in your hospitals and laboratories and on the EU market, there will be a mixture of devices that are certified to the directives, which we call legacy devices, and devices that are MDR and IVDR compliant, which were assessed for their conformity after the date of application, the May 2021 time for devices and 22 for IVDs. So that's really a summary of the regulatory requirements that I just wanted to kind of set the scene with this morning. And I suppose I'd like now to talk about our role within the HPRA in regulating and overseeing the devices sector in Ireland. So, as we know, we're not involved in the authorisation or approval of medical devices, and our role is primarily in the post-market phase after devices are placed on the market, and we're involved in compliance and safety issues. So it's really important that we get your feedback from your use of the device. If you see that there's an issue, something has gone wrong with those devices, that you know how you can feed that back to us and to the manufacturer of those devices, so that there's a continual life cycle approach to the oversight of those devices, and it feeds back into the continued design and development of those devices over time. But we also have a role with device regulation before they're placed on the market. And I suppose if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, it's really in the design phase and the pre-market phase where we would help provide regulatory guidance to developers, device developers and innovators who may not have access to full regulatory personnel in-house, but they need to understand what are the regulatory requirements that they need to follow in order to conduct a clinical investigation or a performance study, and to meet the technical and clinical requirements to allow their device to be assessed by a notified body. So while we don't authorise medical devices, and that's carried out by this independent third party called a notified body, we do have a role in overseeing those notified bodies, both in Ireland, and we have a role in the monitoring of the European notified bodies too. So our role in overseeing the notified bodies is that we look at the activities that they're carrying out. Firstly, in terms of them being designated, we're responsible for designating those notified bodies as being competent and having the appropriate resource in place to assess the devices for their particular technologies. And we have to continually monitor and oversee those notified bodies and ensure that they continue to meet that high standard of requirements. And obviously in the post-market phase, we have a significant role in monitoring the investigations carried out by manufacturers on any safety or regulatory issues associated with their devices. And really, you'll hear Paddy talk later today, we are really encouraging getting more information from you in the health service around your experience of using these devices so that we can appreciate any challenges and any issues associated with those devices on the Irish market. So in summary, really our role is to help ensure that devices on the market are safe and they perform as intended. There's some of our activities are listed here on the slide, and I guess the ones in the navy boxes are probably most relevant to the people here in the room today. You know, we authorise clinical investigations and performance studies, in terms of demonstrating compliance with the requirements before they get to market. We also maintain a register of devices and validate registrations on UDAMED. So these are for manufacturers, the distributors, and importers, and authorised representatives. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I guess the regulations also capture the full supply chain from end to end and have key requirements spelled out for each actor in that supply chain to ensure we can maintain the integrity of those devices throughout. I guess I spoke about the market surveillance and vigilance role that we have, and we monitor compliance investigations of incidents by manufacturers, and we communicate with health systems on safety and compliance issues. So we really need and encourage that two-way feedback. And yes, we do enforce the regulations where we don't have voluntary cooperation. In general, we worked within a system where we do have good cooperation from the actors in the supply chain, and bringing the devices into compliance and ensuring actions are followed through on. So what impact does the regulatory system have for you all working with medical devices and IVDs in the health service? I guess, in the majority of cases, devices that you're working with in the labs and in the hospitals, these are CE marked. They're manufactured by commercial entities who have gone through the appropriate conformity assessment route, and they're engaging with device users on their experience to ensure the post-market data and safety issues are captured, investigated, recorded, and fed back into the device design and development to ensure appropriate upgrades and amendments can take place. But really, it's really important that everyone is aware that there are obligations for all actors, including device users and health systems, called out in the regulations. So from device design, manufacturing, use, the post-market requirements, and the reporting of safety issues. So I suppose I have mentioned already that devices must be CE marked for their intended medical purpose. The conformity is the responsibility of the manufacturer. It's supported by the technical documentation. Devices are registered, and then they're placed on the market with the CE mark. But the life cycle approach is so important that the experience of those devices from the market are fed back in to the manufacturer to ensure we have that life cycle approach of oversight and continual improvement. I guess in terms of supply chain integrity and ensuring that any device used on a patient is CE marked and conforms with the general safety and performance requirements, I mentioned all of the obligations that are set out for each actor in the supply chain. So it's really important you know what your obligations are, to know what activities you're conducting, and are you taking on a role that you're not familiar with within that system. So for health systems, you need to have effective systems for appropriate level of checks on devices and awareness on the requirements, depending on the role within the health service, within the laboratory, within the hospital. There are likely going to be different levels of checks that will need to be conducted in different departments, and depending on the procurement practices in your institution and organisation and those controls that you might have on procurement. So I guess it's really important that if devices are procured centrally, those people involved and responsible in that department for that procurement, that they know what documentation they should be checking, that they know how to go onto the European database EUDAMED and verify some device actors and devices themselves, and that they know that their systems and procedures will ensure devices are stored, managed appropriately at an institutional level for the safe use and delivery of healthcare. As an example, I guess a theatre manager or a laboratory manager should know how to recognise a CE mark and the documentation accompanying it, so the device, the declaration of conformity. A healthcare professional or a clinician or a laboratory analyst will likely not have the detail, around that technical documentation, but should at the very least know that a device needs to be CE marked and how to recognise that. And that can ensure that CE marked devices are used on patients when analysing patient samples or on the patients themselves. So I guess in terms of verifying compliance, it's important that you have an effective system in place to enable the appropriate level of checks to be conducted by the person in the delivery of that device to the patient. I suppose this slide kind of just sets out some of the more practical checks, but it's really, I guess, for you to consider the organisation within your institution around procurement checks as well, and to see what role you need to play in that, and how and who is conducting those verification checks in your institution. So we've just kind of set out here, you need to check firstly that there's a CE mark, that you recognise the notified body 4-digit number that accompanies the CE mark for those devices that have been assessed by a third party. We need to check it to ensure that the device is compliant, and we can check this through the review of technical documentation, to request technical documentation from the manufacturer, supplier of those devices, and primarily the declaration of conformity. You can carry out physical checks on the devices and also check the EUDAMED device registration database. And I would say that not every person in the hospital needs to conduct this check. It's really, I suppose, up to each institution to establish an appropriate mechanism at the appropriate level within the hospital, in the departments concerned, and to have clear systems in place around that. So I guess, I've mentioned a lot about devices must be CE marked to be used on patients, but what about the exceptions to the rules? And I guess we always have exceptions to the rule. Non-CE marked devices are in general used in the minority of cases. They have different requirements to the standard framework and how it's applied to CE marked devices. And two such cases where this might come up are in custom-made device use and in in-house device manufacturing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So custom-made devices are specifically called out in the regulations throughout the chapters. There's a clear legal definition as to what qualifies as custom-made, and really it means any medical device, first and foremost, It's specifically made in accordance with the written prescription of a qualified person, so a clinician and a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, etc., by virtue of their professional qualification, and it gives specific design characteristics to those devices, and it's intended solely for use on a specific patient. The device shouldn't be mass-produced or batch-produced, and the requirements are spelt out in Annex 13 of the Medical Device Regulation, and an Annex 13 statement needs to be prepared, I guess, instead of the CE mark. Typically, custom-made devices are manufactured by commercial entities, and I guess that entity will have the appropriate systems in place for quality management systems where they're manufacturing CE mark devices as well, and they will manufacture these custom-made devices under the prescription from the qualified person under the same systems. And I guess it doesn't really affect health institutions around that, but just to know, I suppose it's good to know the process around those and how that works in practice. So the manufacturer would make sure that it meets the quality management system requirements, the general safety and performance requirements, and that they're registered appropriately either on UDMED or nationally with the HPRA. And some examples of custom-made devices are on the slide here, and we know that some health systems manufacture orthotics such as splints, and these are designed, moulded and manufactured in the health institution to a prescription and may qualify as custom-made devices. So it's important to know that this Annex 13 statement applies to you if you're carrying out this activity within your hospital, that you need to register with us. And I guess some of the Annex 13 requirements are listed here for you for reference. And I guess there are specific details required that need to be documented within that statement. In terms of in-house manufactured devices, I guess, under the old directives didn't refer to in-house manufacturing. But this is a new provision in the MDR and the IVDR, which won't have been included under the directives, but there are specific obligations set out for in-house manufacturing. And while there are exemptions from the full rigour of the regulations for in-house manufacture, it's not necessarily a least burdensome regulatory approach, and I guess you need to consider about the appropriateness of in-house manufacturing within your institution. I guess the regulations call out, the scope of the in-house provision, and really it's the manufacture and use of devices within health institutions on a non-industrial scale to address the specific needs of a target patient population that isn't met by an already CE marked alternative device. There are requirements called out in Article 5.5 of both the MDR and IVDR, and these are set out, some examples of these are set out here. So there is a requirement to have an appropriate quality management system, to demonstrate compliance with the general safety and performance requirements. That device cannot be transferred to another legal entity. You need to justify the target patients group's needs, how they're not met by an already CE marked alternative, and maintain documentation around the manufacturing. You must review data from the clinical use of these devices and take corrective actions as appropriate, and you have to register with the HPRA. So that's just an example of some of the requirements around in-house manufacturing, and I think it's really I guess there is a difference and a nuance between custom-made and in-house, and it's important to understand the differences there if you are conducting those activities. Some examples of in-house manufactured devices include, a health institution that might develop software that's used on site by a healthcare professional where there's no CE marked alternative, and I guess self-tests, for example, that are leaving the hospital, they would not be considered an in-house manufactured device. So there's just some examples that you can have a look through. We will happy to share these slides afterwards. So I just want to kind of close off now with some key message for health systems and what I hope, I guess, in terms of what has been said already today, health system partnerships are really key for the HPRA in terms of our strategic goals, but on a practical level, it's crucial to giving effect to our role as a regulator of medical devices. We need to get that feedback from you as users of these devices and your experience from the market. We would urge you to be aware of the requirements, to have a look at the activities that are conducted in your institution. How do these fit within the regulatory framework? Are you just using CE mark devices, or are you carrying out other activities that might push you into another role or other obligations set out therein? I guess you need to make sure again that you have processes and checks in place to ensure that you're compliant with the regulations, and to, I guess, have appropriate governance systems established around these too. And I think really in terms of, engagement and contact points with the HPRA, we really would encourage you to come to us for, if there are particular challenging areas that you've identified and you're not sure what way to approach it, to come and talk to us about that. And we will endeavour to either develop some communications for general consumption as well, or to discuss with you bilaterally. We have some resources as well. We have a HPRA webpage which addresses requirements for health services and health systems in using medical devices and IVDs. And I have mentioned the UDAMED database throughout the presentation, and I just have included a link to the public site there that might be of use to you in your future operations. So I think that ends the presentation on the regulatory requirements for now, and if you've any questions, will we take them after Donal's or now? I don't mind.